talk about injuries. So if you do get injured performing or training, there's the RICE concept, and that's rest, ice, compression, elevation. You're going to want to rest whatever's injured. You're going to want to elevate it, compress it with ice, 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off, and if you've got the time, do 3 cycles. A lot of people will say, oh, I iced for 45 minutes last night before bed, and after the 20-minute initial icing, it starts to actually do damage or not do what you want it to do. You want it to be flushing the swelling and inflammation out of this injured structure. So 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off, 3 times is going to give you the best results for the icing. I highly recommend the use of compression clothing and KT tape. Compression clothing allows for a quicker recovery because it gets your blood back to the heart faster. It's going to be compressing different structures, say your arms, legs, and it's going to help force blood flow while you're in activity, but more importantly, when you're finished, it's going to force the blood flow again back to your heart to help you recover faster, which is going to be beneficial because then you're going to be ready to go quicker for the next activity. Let's talk about KT tape. So kinesiology tape is something you can use to add stability to a structure, ligament, muscle, as well as limit mobility of that structure to help prevent further injury, increase recovery, and alleviate pain. So I like to use the analogy of, you picture somebody that's wearing one of those neoprene knee braces with the circle in the middle for the patella, and say they've got a tweaked MCL. So they need to have some extra stability in their MCL. They're wearing this knee brace that's propriocepting all these different structures that don't need to be supported. So with the KT tape, you can site specifically support what needs to be supported while letting your muscles and all the other ligaments and structures you have that have their own proprioceptors in them do the job that they need to do. So they're not going to get weakened, you're not going to be dependent on that knee brace, and at some point, hopefully, everything is strong enough you won't even need the Kinesio tape. So you can see once I've got it on, I've got that limited mobility, forward, backward, yet I'm stable, free movement in every direction. So I can still have that focus on my flexibility, strength, range of motion without feeling like I'm going to get trapped in a spot that I don't have the extra support. It's a really, really great thing about the Kinesio tape. So just to recap, it's RICE, rest, ice, compression, and elevation. Stay active.